Welcome to W. Williams Confined Space Entry Awareness Level Training. In this topic, we're going to review the major hazards that are involved in a confined space and some of the steps you can take to minimize the risk of getting hurt or even potentially die. What we'll cover is what is a confined space, the types of spaces that are out there, the definition of a confined space, whether it's non-permit or permit required, the reclassification steps that may need to take place, hazards that may exist, such as atmospheric hazards, the responsibilities of an entrant, attendant, or supervisor, the equipment and personal protective equipment that may be needed for you to enter a confined space, methods of controlling hazards, air monitoring and ventilation requirements, emergency procedure, communication during entry, safe entry procedures, and finally, we'll talk about how it affects us as contractors. So one of the things that OSHA requires us is to have a confined space entry program. Why? To make sure that we've identified all the spaces that may qualify as a confined space, that we're aware of the hazards that may be present in these typical confined spaces. Make sure that we have safety procedures and controls in place to minimize unauthorized employees going in or prohibit them, and that the employees that are actually going in to perform work are properly trained, protected, and we have rescue systems in place in case anything would go wrong. Essentially, it's a method for you to stay alive if you're going to confined space. So every year, hundreds of people die in confined spaces. Everything from excavation at construction sites, tunnels, sewage, tanks, pits. The main reason is employees aren't aware. They don't recognize the hazards when they're there. And frankly, some of the hazards are invisible. They may be the atmospheres in which the employees are entering. They don't really trust their senses. They underestimate the danger. For example, going into a simple mixing tank may not be a big idea. However, if it's full of flammable vapors, which can overwhelm you and cause you to collapse and ultimately die, obviously that poses a big hazard. And they don't realize how quickly a deadly atmosphere can overtake them. Lastly is they try to rescue other people. And that's one of the most important parts of the confined space standard, is making sure that we don't only rely on 911 for rescue. There's actually companies that what they do for a living is have rescue systems in place as contractors. So to make sure that whoever's going to confined space has proper rescue systems, CPR, oxygen, and first aid available. So let's go over the definition of what is a confined space. A confined space is something that must meet three criteria. It has to be large enough and configured so that you as an employee cannot enter and perform any assigned work. It's not designed for you to be in the space for a continuous employee. So that means you can't be there for 8 hours. And it had limited means of entry or exit. So if it has a hatch, a porthole, a pit in which you have to climb into, that has limited means of entry or exit. If it has a man door where you can walk in and out of, even if it's something that's very hot or very cold, the fact that it has a man door and it doesn't have limited means of entry or exit eliminates it from being a confined space. Similarly, if it's something where you can be there for 8 hours, it has a desk and a chair, well then that doesn't make it a confined space. In addition, if a space contains a hazardous atmosphere, materials which can engulf or swallow an entrant, has an internal configuration that can lead to entrapment or asphyxiation, or any other recognized serious safety and health hazards, such as falls, extreme temperatures, slips, that all leads for that space to be considered a permit-required confined space. Let's go through some examples. Dip tanks. tanks on their own may be just big empty boxes. But when you're cleaning up after a residue that contain acid, all you have to do is fall in a little bit of batch, or it can splash on you, and you can have an acid burn. Mixers and pits all may contain atmospheres or conditions which may cause you to fall, internal configuration which may confuse you and can hinder your ability to rescue yourself. Sometimes pits, for example in barges, as the metal is rusting, it's using up oxygen. So when you go down into the entrance of the barge, there may be enough oxygen, about 20%. But as you go into the barge and that rust takes place, the oxygen concentration may dip into the 17%, which is now a hypoxic atmosphere. And that may lead you to pass out, possibly even die. Other common confined spaces that are observed is dust collectors, silos, grain bins. So you have to do a quick evaluation of what are those scenarios in which you may enter a confined space. Again, something that is not designed for you to be in there for a continuous amount of time. It has limited entry or exit, and is a configuration which can prevent you from leaving. So let's talk about, as W.W. Williams employees, what are the confined spaces that can be encountered? Well, sometimes there's pits in the dynos, the water clarifiers, in the oil water separators. Some of our remote employees may enter ship hulls. Some may enter different tanks. And so that's a confined space. This course is mainly to warn you about the hazards that may be present in confined spaces. This is not an entrant or an authorized level of training. For that, additional training is needed, and sometimes even a rescue drill may take place. So as an employer, what are general requirements? Well, we need to identify, classify, and mark confined spaces. It is important that we let employees know where our confined spaces are, what they are, where they're at. We also have to prevent unauthorized entry, either by locking entrances, bolting them, or in any other way making them inaccessible to unauthorized personnel. We also have to evaluate the hazards in the space. Develop safe procedures for entry, including identification of all the potential hazards, their control mechanisms, and what kind of rescue operations would take place if something were to go wrong. The testing procedures that would need to take place prior for you to entry, the permit system, equipment and PPE, and you need to conduct an annual training. Maintain emergency procedures, whether it's going to be an on-site rescue team or you're going to rely on either municipal or a 911 system to come get you. Some municipalities require actually a written agreement between you and their 911 system. And if possible, reclassify. Essentially, we eliminate the permit requirement, so long as all the conditions have been met prior to entry. So within the confined space program, there's various involvement. There's the entry supervisor, the authorized entrant, and the attendant. The entry supervisor is typically a manager or a supervisor that is overseeing the work being conducted. The entrant, well, that's self-explanatory. That's the guy that's going into the tank or the silo or the pit. The attendant, that's the guy that's posted outside of that entrance, that is in constant communication with the entrant. In case anything were to go wrong, that person is the one that's going to get help. He's not allowed to ever leave the entrance. So what is considered an entry? Well, technically, when any body part breaks the plane of an opening to perform work, you're doing a confined space entry. So if you're sticking your face in there to take a look at the conditions, that's considered entry. If you're sticking your hand in there to do any cleaning, that's considered entry. And thus, all the procedures have to be followed. So let's take a look at the common hazards. There's atmospheric hazards: carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, methane, dust. There's engulfment risks for either water, chemicals, materials. There's entrapment. Essentially, it's a maze-like interior. Boiler rooms happen to be that. Mechanical hazards, if you're going into a facility or in a space that contains an agitator, a fan, a mixer. Extreme temperatures. Our reaction times decrease dramatically when we are exposed to cold. Chemical residues, high noise levels, slick or wet surfaces, fall hazards, electrical shocks, fallen objects, and sometimes we learn as we go. That's why it's important to do a full analysis prior to entry. Prior to entry, the testing has to take place. What we do is we determine how much oxygen is in the area, if there's any flammables, toxics, or any carbon monoxide. And we do it in a very specific manner. We start at the top, the middle, at the bottom. First, we test for oxygen, then your flammables, then your toxics. So, within oxygen concentrations, we want to be between 19.5 and about 20.5%. Anything below that, you're getting into hypoxic, and you can pass out. Anything richer than that, now we run into a condition that may lead to an extreme fire or even an explosion. Like I said, if there's any welding, that can lead to carbon monoxide. Any organic material that had been left there previously, that can lead to methane or hydrogen sulfide. And if there is any type of hazardous environment, you're not allowed to enter. Forced air ventilation is required. You may have seen those if you ever driven by and the utility companies working. Essentially, there's big hoses that are coming down into the ground, and there's a pump far away from the entrance, far away from vehicles, that's pumping in fresh air. You can't use oxygen. It has to be fresh air. And when you're in there, you have to test periodically to make sure that the conditions haven't changed. Oxygen hasn't dipped, methane hasn't been introduced, carbon monoxide hasn't been generated. So continuous monitoring is required. For contractors, essentially any non-employees that are going into confined space, we have to be very careful. We have to make sure that we have a full entry system in place for those confined spaces which are not declassified. As contractors, we must be informed of the spaces that are considered confined spaces, what these hazards are, what procedures the company has to protect the employees from these hazards, and then any type of emergency rescue personnel or equipment or teams that are available. We need to make sure that these are reviewed if we're going to a confined space at our client site. So in conclusion, stay alert, look for signs of confined spaces, learn to identify these. If you are going into confined space as a contractor, make sure that you review their permit and rescue system. Wear all PPE as necessary. Communicate. In this situation, over-communication is best. And if we follow all the entry procedures, everyone will be safe. If you have any questions, please contact your customer service manager or any of the safety team members. Thank you.